This is an exciting program for us. We're pleased to have today Senator Mitch McConnell. Senator McConnell is the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate. He's only the second Kentuckian to lead his party in the United States Senate. And we're looking forward to hearing Senator McConnell's remarks. Before we get started, we would like to recognize some of our special guests today. I'll start with Commerce Lexington Board of Directors. Thank you for all you do. Also, the Commerce Lexington Public Policy Council, which helped put together this program and puts together all of our programs. That's chaired by Carla Blanton. You'll be hearing from Carla later in the program. But thank you to that group in particular for these outstanding events. We have a number of elected officials with us today, and we'd like to recognize each of them and ask if you would please stand. We'll start with Congressman Andy Barr. All right, I don't see Congressman Barr. Kentucky State Senate President Robert Stivers. State Senator Katie Stein, President Pro Tem. State Senator Alice Forgy Kerr. State Senator Chris McDaniel. State Representative Robert Benvenuti. State Representative Ryan Quarles. Joe Larson, Fayette County Judge Executive. John Larson. Judge Gary Moore, County Judge Executive for Boone County. Judge Larry Van Meter, Kentucky Court of Appeals. Also with us today are Terry Carmack, State Director for Senator Mitch McConnell. If you would stand. Regina Stivers, Field Representative for Senator McConnell. Amanda Trail, Field Representative for Senator McConnell. And Kevin Atkins with the Mayor's Office, City of Lexington. The public policy events have become signature events for Commerce Lexington over the last few years, and they wouldn't be possible without the generous support of our many sponsors. Our sponsors have been scrolling on the screen and will continue to do so. But we would not be able to present these events. They wouldn't be at the quality they are without our sponsors. We very much appreciate everything that our sponsors do. We're very happy to recognize Kentucky American Water Company as the presenting sponsor of our public policy luncheons. And at this time, I'd like to ask Keith Cartier to come forward and say a few words on behalf of Kentucky American Water.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Ken. We do appreciate the opportunity to offer a few remarks, and we're going to be very brief. You know, Kentucky American Water was formed more than 125 years ago as an investor-owned company, to meet the water needs of our local community. And since the beginning, the men and women of Kentucky American Water have continued working in partnership with the communities we serve. And we've continued to invest in our infrastructure and in our systems to meet the growing needs as Lexington and Central Kentucky grew. And on behalf of our current employees, the men and women who work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, I just want to convey how proud we are to continue sponsoring these public policy luncheons. As we all know, the interest in this Senate race extends far beyond Kentucky. To me, it really is amazing that Commerce Lexington is able to recruit speakers the caliber of Senator McConnell on such a recurring basis. And I really want to thank the staff and the folks involved in scheduling this discussion and next Wednesday's discussion. Senator, thank you for your time today. Really do appreciate that. I know everyone's looking forward to hearing from Senator McConnell. I hope everyone does enjoy today's event. Thank you. Ken, back to you.
Keith, thank you, and thank you to Kentucky American Water and all of our sponsors. When we have a special guest, we frequently like to have that person introduced by someone who, a community and business leader, and someone who knows them. And today we're fortunate to have Mr. Joe Kraft introduce Senator McConnell. I know Mr. Kraft is well known to everyone in the room. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Alliance Energy Resources, a marketer and producer of coal. He's an advocate for energy issues and policies both in the state and nationally. Mr. Kraft is a proud graduate of the University of Kentucky. He is a member of the Business College Hall of Fame and the Law School Hall of Fame at the UK College of Law. Now, one thing I share with the next two speakers is we're all UK College of Law graduates, which is great. I know a number of others in the room too, several from my class. One thing that's different is they're both in the Hall of Fame and I'm not. So the law schools, I'll have to advocate for that. So Mr. Kraft is a native of Hazard, Kentucky. He is a member of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce Board. He serves on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And we're pleased to have Mr. Kraft here today to introduce Mr. McConnell.
Thanks, Ken. And it's an honor for me to be here today and say that for my fellow businessmen that love to create opportunities and jobs, the future of our economy is something that is close to my mind and close to my heart, and I think will be highly affected by this upcoming election. So it is a critical election, I believe, because of the policies of President Obama. Last week, President Obama made the statement that he's not on the ballot, but his policies are. And that statement rings totally true to the state of Kentucky. I want to make 3 points. You know, President Obama's past EPA policies have already cost the state of Kentucky tens of thousands of jobs and over $100 million of annual revenue loss and severance tax in 2013 versus 2011, which we expect will continue for the near future. Over the next 12 to 24 months, the country will be debating the president's proposed policies on greenhouse gas regulations for new and existing coal-fired power plants. If his proposed rules are adopted as is, the electricity rates in Kentucky, and these are his words, will necessarily skyrocket. And that will put at risk not tens of thousands of jobs, but hundreds of thousands of jobs in the manufacturing sector, the mining sector, and related businesses that service those jobs. In addition, we believe that will send many of those jobs overseas, as our competition is more global competitors than it is another state. And my second point is that the cost of these regulations are real, but the benefits are not. There have been a couple of studies, again, trying to assess the impact of these regulations if they're adopted as is, and the conclusions of those studies suggest that by 2030, the global emissions in the world would be projected to rise to 29.2% under these regulations, as opposed to 31% without them. Now, the pain to hundreds of thousands of Kentuckians that are displaced and the economic damage to our budget because of these regulations would be significant. The benefits are non-detectable. Finally, over the past 6 years, we have seen and experienced the damage of President Obama and Coal Makes Me Sick, Harry Reid's policies and what they've had on our state, and it's time we stop them in their tracks. Electing Mitch McConnell and a Republican majority to the U.S. Senate is the only way to end this insanity. Senator Mitch McConnell has provided more leadership than any person in America in holding the line against the Obama assault. For Kentucky to prosper, Mitch McConnell needs to be the next majority leader of the U.S. Senate. Fellow Kentuckians, please join me in welcoming a warrior, a strong advocate for free enterprise, a fighter for all Kentuckians, our great Senate leader, Mitch McConnell.
Well, thank you. Well, goodness, I kind of hated for Joe to stop. Thank you very much, Joe, for an exceedingly gracious introduction. Let me get right to the point here. You know, we learned very early on in school that elections have consequences. The people who win elections make policy, and the people who don't go on to do something else. And in 2008, our friends on the other side had an extraordinary election. A brand new president who won by a substantial majority. His party had a 40-seat majority in the U.S. House, 60 votes in the Senate. For those of you who have normal lives and are not political junkies, 51 is a majority, but 60 is really control in the Senate because a lot of the things we do require a supermajority. In other words, they had the votes. They could do whatever they wanted to, and they did. The $1 trillion stimulus, Obamacare, Dodd-Frank. For those of you who are not in financial services, the best way to describe Dodd-Frank is Obamacare for banks. And Joe outlined what's going on through the unelected part of the government, the bureaucracy, the executive branch, the people who work for the president, have engaged in massive overregulation all over the country in every sector of our society. And there's an attitude on the part of these regulators, an adversarial approach to regulation. You can sense that their view is if you're making a profit, you must surely be up to no good. You must be cheating your customers or mistreating your employees. And they're here to help you. They're here to help you. And the most conspicuous example of that is right here in Kentucky. We have a depression in eastern Kentucky. 7,000 coal mining jobs so far, and you know for every coal mining job you lose 3 more. And Joe mentioned utility rates. Now, Toyota's in Kentucky for 2 reasons. One is location, and the other is low-cost electricity. Thanks to our abundance of coal and 90% of our electricity coming from coal-fired generation, we've been among the lowest 4 or 5 in any given year of any state in the country in the cost of doing business. Joe, I was down in far western Kentucky yesterday, a plant, and I had sort of assumed they were there mainly because of the water, but that was important. But they said, you know, what really turned it for us was the cost of electricity. So you see, my friends, a war on coal is not just a war on coal-producing counties. It's a war on all of Kentucky. And Joe also pointed out what this crusade is about: global carbon emissions. The press is always amused when I say, in response to a question about this particular crusade, that I'm not a scientist. Well, I think it's pretty obvious I'm not a scientist. But you don't have to be a scientist to assess the impact of this on the problem if you thought it was a problem that ought to be addressed. If you thought it was a problem that ought to be addressed, what kind of impact is this going to have on it? Almost nothing. You know, this movement started in Europe. Germany was the greenest country in Europe. They're now importing coal. The Chinese and the Indians are building coal plants. Coal plants. And by the way, I bet you noticed that the Australians just a couple of months ago repealed their carbon tax, because of what it was doing to their own economy. Their carbon tax is similar to what the president's doing through EPA that Joe outlined, targeting existing power plants and making sure we don't ever build any new ones. Everybody else has figured this out, except us. So you see, this is all pain, and even if you believe in the cause, no gain. No gain. Now, this administration is the reason this is the most tepid recovery after a deep recession since World War II. I've looked at all of them, and the pattern has been the deeper the recession, the quicker the bounce back until this one. You don't have to be too smart to figure out what we did differently this time. It was the borrowing, the spending, the taxing, and the overregulation. All have made it difficult for our great entrepreneurial country to do what it does best, which is to grow and prosper and hire people. Now, the president wouldn't have put it this way, but he wanted to turn us into a Western European country. And of course, what they all have in common is big debts, high taxes, overregulation, and slow growth. And of course, slow growth is the biggest threat to the next generation. How many 18 to 30-year-olds, the ones who most enthusiastically supported the president, are living back at home now? Living back at home now because of the absence of jobs and opportunity. And some of you are shaking your head and say, but I've been seeing the unemployment rate going down. Most of you know, many of you know my wife, and most of you know who she is. She was Secretary of Labor during the Bush years. She explained to me how they compute unemployment. It's based on what's called the labor participation rate. In other words, how many people are looking for work. My friends, the labor participation rate in our country is what it was in the Carter administration. Obviously, the country's a lot bigger now, right? But fewer and fewer people are looking because they've given up and dropped out. So the real unemployment rate is probably up in double digits. So this perception that we're coming back, I hope we are, but there's not a whole lot of tangible evidence of it. There are sectors of our economy that are doing well. Most of them are the ones least impacted by government policy. But overall, this is a very, very tepid economic recovery based on our own historical standards. So the question becomes, if you are among those who think America is not headed in the right direction, what can be done about it? Well, there's only one thing that can be done in 2014 to begin to turn America in a different direction, and that's to change the Senate. And so let me talk about that a minute. If the American people decide to change the Senate, here's what will happen. The guy you're looking at will be the offensive coordinator instead of the defensive coordinator. The Wildcats are on the cusp of having a very good year. You all have renewed interest in football here, which is astonishing everyone. And you know you can occasionally score on defense, but only occasionally. The offensive coordinator gets to call the plays and has a better chance of putting points on the board. And that's the way it works in the Senate. I've enjoyed being the defensive coordinator. I appreciate the confidence of my colleagues, although I must tell you, as I was saying to Spencer Noe here a while ago, becoming leader of my party has certainly made my races more interesting. The last time I ran, before I got this extra job for my colleagues, I got 64% of the vote and carried 113 out of 120 counties. Those were the good old days. In any event, what difference does it make to the country and then to Kentucky to change the Senate? To the country, it will mean at least the following. most of you will not know this and don't think you're uninformed for not knowing it, but the president's only vetoed 2 bills in 6 years. And they were little bills that were drafted improperly. There was a technical problem with them. Why has he vetoed no bills? Well, the first 2 years, he loved everything he got. There were signing ceremonies and pens handed out, and everybody was thrilled with Obamacare and all. You got the drift. Since then, the last 4 years, the role the United States Senate has played is to make sure the president never gets anything that he doesn't like or that makes him uncomfortable. So we don't do anything in the Senate anymore. We don't even vote anymore. In fact, there's a freshman Democrat running for re-election in Alaska. Obviously, he's been here 6 years. He's never had a roll call vote on an amendment on the floor of the Senate in his whole term. Most people think that's what we do. So the Senate's just been shut down, and we only do the most basic things, operate the government, just basic things. Why? Because that leaves the president's initiatives in the hands of those who work for him, in the executive branch, on the independent agencies. These guys work for him. They share his views, and they can only be successfully interfered with the only tool the Congress really has, which is the power of the purse. So point one, about how changing the Senate might change the country, what we will do is pass a budget, because the House and Senate don't do that anymore either, among the things we don't do. We'll be able to agree with Speaker Boehner and his team about how much the government ought to spend, and then we will pass appropriation bills that provide the funding for the agencies, and in those bills we will put directions, restrictions. The inside the Beltway term is riders. We will literally write into the bills restrictions on certain activities. And right at the top of my list, obviously, are the coal regulations. But we're going to do this in other areas too, because the bureaucracy has been running amok for 6 years. Now, all of you know that the president in our system has the last word because he can veto a bill, but at least he's going to have to consider the pros and cons of bills that he will finally get on his desk that question his priorities. And typically, the governor of Kentucky has a line item veto, so he can go into a bill and just pluck something out he doesn't like. The president of the United States does not have that. So we intend to use the power of the purse to try to rein in this out-of-control bureaucracy that's strangling the economy, and the best obvious example of that is what they're trying to do to the coal industry. What difference does it make to Kentucky, specifically, to have the offensive coordinator? There have been 2 Kentuckians in our history who've been leader of one of the 2 parties in the Senate. Alben Barkley, who led the Democrats when they were both in the majority and the minority back in the 30s and 40s, and the fellow you're looking at. As the defensive coordinator, I'm in a pretty good position to look out for Kentucky, and I'll give you just a few examples. The tobacco buyout, the hemp legislation, which had to have federal approval for the pilot projects that are going on that Commissioner Comer recommended we do. As the defensive coordinator, I've been in 3 negotiations with the administration on fairly critical issues. Joe Biden and I did the 2-year extension of the Bush tax cuts in December 2010, the August 2011 Budget Control Act, and the one I would point out that I think is most noteworthy from a Kentucky point of view, the December 31st, 2012 fiscal cliff deal. It was New Year's Eve. I'm sure you remember where you were. You don't remember where I was. I was not with Elaine. I was with Biden again. The Bush tax cuts were expiring once again. This was after the 2-year extension. What I wanted out of that, more than anything else, in addition to trying to protect as many people as I could from a tax increase, and we did succeed in protecting 99% of the Bush tax cuts. But the thing that I thought would have the biggest impact on Kentucky was the $5 million per person estate tax exemption, to try to make that permanent law and index it to inflation. And that was my ask. That was the thing that I insisted on. Now, why was that important? A $5 million per person permanent estate tax exemption will save virtually every family farm and small business in Kentucky from being sold on date of death, and thereby make it possible to get it down to the next generation. There are a lot of small businesses and family farms that look like they're pretty flush, except they're cash poor. And this is enormously disruptive in trying to get what you've spent your lifetime building down to the next generation. It's not going to save everybody, but it will save almost everybody from that kind of disruption at the end of life. As the offensive coordinator, I will not only be able to do those kinds of things from an even stronger position, but make sure Kentucky's interests are protected all along the way, setting the agenda not only for the entire country, but looking out for Kentucky's interest along the way. Now, my opponent's a new face, I will concede that. But I think it's appropriate for you to ask the question, a new face to do what? A new face for the status quo, to vote for the president's agenda, to make Harry Reid, who said coal makes you sick, the majority leader, a new face for the status quo. Because change, my friends, is not about how new you are, but where you want to go. And I'm not happy with where we are. I want to go in a different direction. So if you're happy with where we are, maybe she's your candidate. But if you think we can do better, we ought to go in a different direction. I can't think of a more dramatic loss of influence than to trade me in for my opponent. I'll tell you a story that illustrates what it's like to be a rookie in the Senate. I had just gotten there. I was 99th out of 100 in overall seniority, dead last on the Republican side. We don't do everything by seniority. My leadership position has nothing to do with seniority. That's an election from your colleagues. But we do a lot on a seniority basis, up to and including even the location of our desk on the Senate floor. So as you can imagine, I had the very last desk all the way over in the corner where the light's not even very good. If you've ever watched C-SPAN 2 on TV, you know we're usually just sort of milling around and not necessarily sitting where we're supposed to, but every once in a while there's a sort of solemn occasion and you're supposed to sit where you're supposed to sit. And so there I was over in the corner by myself, and I remember looking around the room and thinking, none of these people are ever going to die. Retire or be defeated. But alas, I have a pretty good seat now. There's only one better seat. And that's a realistic possibility, because people around the country seem to me to be on the verge of changing directions. And so let me just say this, and then I'll take whatever questions you may have. We've had challenges throughout the history of our country, civil wars, world wars, depressions, and all the rest. We've always had a remarkable ability to come back as a country from whatever challenges we confront. One of my favorite observations about Americans was reportedly made by Winston Churchill. There's some dispute about whether he said it or not, but he would have, and this is exactly what he thought. Churchill said this about all of us. He said, the Americans, they always do the right thing after they've tried everything else first. And so that's how I sort of look at the last 6 years. This has been an experiment in an explosion of government. We've had periods like that in the past. I think it's pretty safe to conclude that this one didn't work out too well, and maybe we want to take some corrective action. So I thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'll be happy to throw it open for a few questions. Thanks.
Senator, thank you for being here today.
Yeah.
Over here in the Amen corner. But I represent the nonprofit sector that's involved in the trenches every day of training people for jobs. Currently, we're spending at our federal level about $18 billion a year for job training, with very little to show for the outcomes. Recently in July, the president signed a new workforce jobs bill called WIOA, as everybody calls it, Workforce Investment Opportunity Act. The current system has very little accountability, so what can we expect in the job training field for more accountability to really get people real jobs that need it?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Again, referring to my wife's time as Secretary of Labor, she was always talking about what she called, and maybe you call as well, the skills gap. I mean, no matter what conditions are in the country, you can pick up the want ads and find plenty of jobs for which there is no one trained to do it. So we've had this ongoing challenge about having people prepared to do the jobs that exist. Now, I do think, from what I've heard, well, we did reauthorize the Workforce Investment Act, as you know, and from what I've heard, a number of these community and college technical schools have done a pretty good job of working with local business to help develop training programs. And in Northern Kentucky, Katie's a good example of that. I think Ed Hughes, for jobs that actually exist, you know, trying to make sure that there's something there for them when they get out. I think it's one of our failings as a country. I think we need to do it better. Let me also touch on the math and science deficit. I expect all of you have heard of the Gatton School at Western. It recently declared the best high school in America, right here in Kentucky, on the Western Kentucky campus. What are they doing down there? Well, Bill Gatton, who's a very generous guy, gave them money to develop this program for kids who are proficient in math and science. There is this visa, the H-1B visa quota is used up in a couple of days every year. What is it? It's the way to bring in foreign youngsters who are proficient in math and science to meet the jobs that are needed in the technology sector and in other sectors. And the reason we need that is we can't fill those positions with the talent that we have here in the country. But places like the Gatton School are working rapidly to try to catch up because we at least recognize the problem, and I think getting to a solution first requires recognizing the problem. I think we're trying to get into a better position to fill those kinds of jobs with American workers. And with regard to the technical skills, I hope we're getting better and better at that. I usually get some kind of report from the community college system in various parts of the state on that very issue. So it is a challenge in our country. We need to do it a lot better.
Yes, I work in banking, and I know there's quite a few bankers in here, and you did mention Dodd-Frank, and we continue to enjoy the benefits of that bill almost every day. But I'm just curious if you are able to take control of the Senate, what might be on the agenda with regard to banking, finance, and Dodd-Frank itself.
Yeah, good question. You know, I don't think the president's going to sign a full repeal of Dodd-Frank. But at the very least, it strikes me the CFPB ought to be responsible to someone. For those of you who are not in financial services, this new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau answers to no one, literally no one, does not come to Congress for appropriated accounts and talk about too big to fail. How about that? Answers to nobody. We think at the very least he might sign a measure that required them to come to Congress for their appropriations and had some kind of oversight board to which the director reported. We might want to go further than that. If I had my way, it wouldn't be on the books at all, because Dodd-Frank, which was sold as the, quote, Wall Street bill, the Wall Street people are doing just fine. They're plenty big enough to handle whatever the government throws at them. Instead, it's whacked community bankers. I was over at a credit union meeting over in Louisville earlier this morning. They hate it too, and it wasn't even supposed to apply to them. Another way to kind of strangle the economy is to make it more difficult for people to borrow, which is precisely what this monstrosity did. So, yeah, we want to go back at it. I don't want you to think that with the President of the United States sitting there with a veto pen, he's likely to take it off the books, but we will certainly try to modify it and push back against it, because just another example of this kind of oppressive, overreaching federal government. I don't remember you guys being so quiet the last time. Yeah, Russell. You want me to talk about Obamacare or ISIS? What if I do both? Well, look, I know this will surprise some of you, but I typically struggle to try to say something good about the president and his administration, but I'm really perplexed to come up with much of anything in regard to our relations with the rest of the world. And I think the best place to start is at the president's much publicized speech to the Muslim world from Cairo back in 2009. You may remember that. It was a well-publicized speech. We were going to have a major reset of our relations with the Muslim world. And what the president basically said in that speech, most people took out of it, was, number one, a denial of American exceptionalism, that there's nothing all that special about us. And since there isn't, if we just talk to each other more, everything will be better. And so that sort of set the parameters of the Obama foreign policy. So let's review the world since then. The first decision that I think has been obviously proven to be a huge mistake was not behind in Iraq a residual force. The military leadership recommended leaving behind a residual force, and if you're looking for parallels, think of Germany and Japan after World War II and Korea after the Korean War. There's something about having an American force there that tends to keep things stable. The president had said during his campaign that the Iraq war was the good war and the Afghan war was the bad war. And I think the reason that developed is because he was running in the primaries against Hillary Clinton, who had supported the Iraq war, although by that point there were no Democrats that supported it, no matter how they voted on the resolution. So it clearly became more important to the president to be able to say by the 2012 election, we're out of Iraq, it's over, we're out, than it was to maximize the chances of stabilizing the gains that were made over the years. Bad mistake number two. 3 years ago, we all thought the Syrian rebels were going to topple Assad. And I think it's noteworthy that Hillary Clinton recently decided to separate herself from that decision too by announcing that she had recommended to the president 3 years ago that he help the Syrian rebels. He decided not to do that. Bad decision number three. Well, it started off as a pretty good decision, but deteriorated. We sent to the president on a bipartisan basis an Iran sanctions bill a few years ago that he really didn't want, but to his credit, he signed it, he used it, and those sanctions brought the Iranians to the table. Our concern at that point, on a bipartisan basis in Congress, concern at that point was that the Iranians would just want to keep on talking. So we recommended that at the end of this 6-month talking period, which expired last July, if nothing happened, they get tougher sanctions. In the State of the Union last year, he threatened to veto that. So the Iranians knew going into the talks, which ended in July, there were a good chance they could just keep on talking. And sure enough, at the end of the talks in July, they got an extension conveniently until after the election in the United States to keep on talking. So, bad decision number 4. The president who said the Afghanistan war was the good war and who ordered his own surge there, which I supported, has announced we're going to leave Afghanistan entirely. The military leadership is so exercised about that. And look, I don't want you all to think that the military is not going to salute and follow orders. They will. They always do in this country. But it was so wrong-headed that the incoming commandant of the Marine Corps, the guy coming in, not the one going out, has publicly said it was a mistake. So what are these military leaders saying? Well, they're saying, we had to write the letters to the parents of the folks who were lost. We had to visit the people who were horribly injured in the war. Whether you thought it was a good war or a bad war, would you not want to give it a maximum chance to be a success by using a model that has previously worked pretty well after a conflict? Bad decision number 5. Vladimir Putin is watching all this, and we know he thinks that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the single biggest geopolitical disaster of the previous century. So he says, I think I'll take Crimea. And he did. And he says, well, I think I'll encroach on eastern Ukraine, and he is. The president of Ukraine, who's a very impressive figure, by the way, addressed a joint session of Congress a few weeks ago, and here's the crux of his speech. He said, thanks for the blankets. Thanks for the blankets. So far, we've sent them blankets and meals ready to eat, MREs, if you haven't been in the military. They would like to have a chance to defend themselves because they're feeling pretty foolish. When the Soviet Union broke up, there were nuclear weapons all over Ukraine. They gave them up in return for territorial guarantees. Well, they got to be feeling stupid, don't you think? Why do these countries want the nuclear weapon? Once you get the bomb, nobody can touch you. So they voluntarily gave up their nuclear weapons, and we're sending them meals ready to eat. I think the president is begrudgingly moving in a different direction. It's awfully late, but I think everybody understands that ISIS or ISIL, they call themselves ISIL, I think we get it. They want to kill us. They've been killing Americans and posting it on the internet in case you missed it. And they're up to about a 30,000 effective force. They control large swaths of Syria and Iraq. Air power is not going to defeat them, but I do think we're doing the right thing now. We're going to have to seriously train the Kurdish forces, and we're going to have to go back in and do the kind of training that we should have done or could have done had we left a residual force in Iraq to try to get their military up to speed, because they're the ones that are going to have to retake this territory if it's going to have to be done. I mean, nobody's advocating refighting the Iraq war, but I really think had we left a residual force behind, those residual forces usually do 2 things in this environment. Number 1 is the ongoing training of the local military, and the other is to have some kind of counterterrorism component just in case you need it. Now, both of those things sound like they'd be pretty useful in this situation, right? It would have been a lot better if we'd been doing that all along the way here. So we are where we are. But let me just conclude with this. Terrorism's not going away. The president sort of announced the war on terror was over. The terrorists didn't get the message, Wars end when both sides decide to end. And this is the scourge of the 21st century. We're going to be dealing with this. It's a serious challenge. Some of these people have U.S. passports. Some of them have British passports. This is going to be with us for a long time. So, we get back to the choice we made after 9/11. You can deal with them here, you can deal with them somewhere else. I bet you share my view that we ought to try as best we can to deal with them somewhere else. Sorry for the lengthy answer, but I think, everything's connected to everything else. Looks like we're out of time here. Well, let me just wrap it up by thanking you for the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate being back in Lexington. Thanks so much.